She was 31 years old, 7 months pregnant, and didn't have a single place in the world she could call home. After 3 days walking down a gravel county road, knocking on gate after gate, and hearing the same answer over and over, Emily Carter stopped at the fence line of the last farm on that road. It was her final chance. Past that property, there was nowhere left to go. On the other side, on the porch of a big white farmhouse, a man sat in a wheelchair letting the morning sun warm his face. Robert Whitfield, 52 years old. A retired army colonel, alone for so long that he'd convinced himself loneliness was simply his lot in life. It had been 22 years since he'd stopped believing in love. 22 years waiting for life to stop taking things from him, and never once expecting it to give anything back. "Morning," she said, her voice tired but steady. "I need work. I can cook. I'll take anything you've got." He studied her for a long moment. A pregnant young woman, cast off by the world, asking for a chance. And that man who swore he needed nobody felt something move in his chest that he'd been certain was dead and buried a long time ago. What neither of them knew was that this meeting, on an ordinary cold morning in the hill country of East Tennessee, was about to change both of their lives forever. Because sometimes life knocks on our gate disguised as a problem, when really it's our second chance walking up the driveway. This is the story of Emily and Robert, the story of how family isn't only the blood we're born into, it's the love we choose, and how it's never, ever too late for a heart to come back to life. Stay with me until the end, because this story is going to remind you of something the world sometimes makes us forget, that kindness still exists, and it shows up exactly when we've stopped expecting it. The dew was still heavy on the grass when Emily felt she couldn't take many more steps. For 3 days she'd been walking that dirt road through the Tennessee hills, stopping at farm gate after farm gate, asking for work, hearing the same answer said a dozen different ways, a no wrapped in pity, a no said flat and cold, a no that came with a long look at her belly, that 7-month belly that walked into a room before she even opened her mouth, like it was announcing that trouble had arrived before she could explain herself. She tightened the strap of the cloth bag on her shoulder, felt her swollen feet complain inside worn-out sneakers, and breathed in the cold morning air, thick with wet earth and the smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere she couldn't see. It wasn't only her body that ached, it was the silence she'd been carrying since the night Daniel walked out. No note, no money, nothing left behind, but a cold side of the bed and a baby growing in a belly that now belonged to her and her alone. Emily didn't cry over him anymore. She'd already cried everything she had to cry. What was left was a question that came back every night when the baby moved and she woke up alone. How does a person take care of another life when she can barely take care of her own? She didn't know the answer. She only knew she had to keep walking, because stopping was a luxury her child's hunger wouldn't allow. That's when she saw it, at the end of the road, a white farmhouse with blue shutters, a front yard so full of color it looked painted on. Roses, black-eyed Susans, a hydrangea bush heavy with purple blooms. There was something about that house that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a hope so sharp it almost hurt, the kind you're afraid to feel because you don't want to be let down again. She stopped at the iron gate, pressed her forehead to the cold metal bars for a second, and gathered up whatever courage she had left. It was the last farm on that road. After this one, she didn't know where else to go. On the wide porch of the farmhouse, sitting in a wheelchair turned toward the sunrise, was a man. Robert took his morning sun the way he did every day, not because he enjoyed it, but out of habit, the kind of habit people build to convince themselves their days still have some kind of order. He had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and his eyes fixed somewhere on the horizon where the blue ridgeline met the sky. 52 years old, half of them spent in the army on polished boots, a command voice, and the other half since the accident spent in that chair, in that house too big for one man alone. Robert didn't expect anything from life anymore, and if you'd asked him, he would have told you he was fine with that. A lie he told so often he almost believed it himself. He heard the gate before he saw who it was. He turned his head slowly, brow furrowing, the old soldier's instinct still alert to anything that broke the routine. And that's when he saw her. A small woman, in a faded floral dress, hair pulled back in a loose bun, one hand cradling her belly, the other bracing against the gate. Even from a distance, even with her face worn down by exhaustion, there was a dignity about her that Robert recognized instantly, because it was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning, the look of someone who's been knocked down plenty by life, but refuses to walk around with her head bowed. "Morning," Emily said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Sorry to bother you so early, sir. I'm looking for work. I can cook. I can really cook. I'll take any day's wage, any little corner to sleep in." Robert stared at her in silence for a stretch that felt too long for both of them. On the other side of the gate, Emily felt her heart sink, already bracing for the usual no, already rehearsing how she'd swallow the disappointment without letting it show. But the man in the wheelchair didn't say no. He didn't say yes either. He just kept looking, like he was reading something written on her face that she herself didn't know was there. "How long you been walking?" he finally asked. His voice was deep, used to giving orders, but there was something underneath it, a roughness trying to hide something else. "Since yesterday morning, sir." Emily hesitated, then decided to tell the truth. "Slept under a tree last night. But I work hard, I swear. I won't be any trouble. I just need a chance." Robert looked away for a second, and in that second he fought a small war inside his chest. One part of him, the part hardened by years of solitude, told him this wasn't a charity house, that he didn't need anybody, that the girl should keep moving down the road. But there was another part, older, almost forgotten, that remembered a kitchen full of the smell of food, a woman humming softly while she stirred a pot, a time when this house was still a home. That was the part that spoke louder when he, going against his own better judgment, rolled his wheelchair toward the gate. "Gate's open," he said, gruff, not quite looking at her. "Kitchen's out back. There's eggs, there's flour, there's what's left of the coffee. If you cook half as good as you say, prove it. Fair warning, though. It's been 22 years since anybody in this house got the coffee right, the way I like it. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me which state you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel." Emily pushed the gate open and felt for the first time in days that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally landed somewhere. She didn't know yet that this rusted iron gate wasn't the end of a hard road. It was the beginning of everything. She was already stepping past him, that 7-month belly leading the way toward the kitchen, when Robert murmured something more to himself than to her. "You need work," he said quietly, his eyes following her tired steps toward the kitchen. And then, without quite knowing why, something in that moment pushed him to finish a truth he'd never said out loud to another living soul in 22 years of silence. "And I think I need a family." The sentence slipped out the way something does when you've been holding it too long. He looked around at the empty house, at the silent horizon, and shook his head, almost laughing at himself. "But that's something I gave up on so long ago I don't hardly know how to say it out loud anymore." Emily didn't hear him. She'd already gone inside, and it was just as well, because that confession wasn't meant for her ears yet. It was a seed that life would take months to bring up out of the ground. The kitchen of the farmhouse was big, high-ceilinged, with a cast-iron wood stove that looked older than Emily herself. Copper pots hung on the wall, coated in a thin layer of dust that told the story of years of neglect. She ran her hand over one of them and felt her chest tighten. This had once been a kitchen that was loved, a kitchen that had fed people, that had been the heart of a home. Now it was just a cold room, where a lonely man warmed up a can of soup. Emily set her bag down in the corner, washed her hands at the stone sink, and got to work, without asking for anything else, because she knew that kitchen was her only shot. While she got the stove going, she thought about her mother. It was her mother who taught her everything she knew, that good food isn't made from expensive ingredients. It's made with care. "Emily, baby," her mother used to say, "you can taste when food's made with love and when it's made in a hurry." Her mother had passed young, taken by an illness that showed no mercy. And ever since, Emily cooked the way some people pray, the way you talk to someone who's already gone. Every egg she cracked, every pinch of salt, was a way of keeping alive a woman the world had already forgotten. And now, in that strange kitchen, she cooked for her son too, for the new life that needed to prove it deserved to exist. Out on the porch, Robert waited, pretending to read a 3-day-old newspaper, but his eyes never moved past the same line. What he was really doing was feeling the smell that started drifting out of the kitchen and spreading through the house. The smell of fresh coffee, of biscuits fried golden in butter, of something simple and at the same time impossible to ignore. It had been so long since that house smelled like real cooking that Robert found himself closing his eyes, breathing deep, letting the memory do what memory does best, hurt and heal at the same time. For one moment, he wasn't the lonely retired colonel anymore. He was a boy in his mother's kitchen waiting for breakfast. When Emily appeared at the porch door balancing a tray, Robert quickly straightened himself in the chair, pulling back on the mask of the hard old man. She set down in front of him a plate of soft scrambled eggs, biscuits browned in butter, and a cup of coffee giving off an aroma he hadn't smelled in years. She stepped back, folded her hands over her belly, and waited in silence, her heart pounding. Everything she had was on that porch table. If this man said no, she had nowhere left to go. Robert picked up the cup first, brought it to his lips slowly, suspicious, the way a man does when he's been let down one too many times. He took a sip and froze. He sat there, cup in hand, staring at some point that wasn't the present at all. That coffee had the exact right balance. Not too strong, not too weak. With that faint touch of sweetness, only someone who truly learned how gets right. It was his mother's coffee. Exactly the coffee his mother used to make in that very kitchen 52 years ago. Robert felt his throat close up in a way he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember, and he had to swallow hard to keep the emotion from reaching his eyes. "Where'd you learn to make coffee like this?" he asked, and the gruffness in his voice now trembled at the edges. "From my mama," Emily answered simply. "She always said good coffee's made with patience. You can't rush it." Robert didn't answer right away. He let the silence say what words couldn't. He looked at this pregnant woman, cast off by the world, who'd slept under a tree, and he looked at the plate of food made with a kind of care no one gives a stranger, and he understood right there that it wasn't only a cook he'd stumbled into needing, it was something else, something he couldn't even name yet, something that had gone quiet inside him so long ago he'd convinced himself it would never come back. "There's a room out back," he said finally, not looking at her, his eyes still fixed on the cup. "Used to belong to my mother's hired girl years and years ago. It's dusty, but it'll do. You can stay." He paused and added, quieter, almost to himself, "For now." Emily had to grab the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling. She nodded, murmured a "thank you, sir," that barely made it out of her throat, and hurried back into the kitchen before he could see the tears. They weren't tears of sadness. They were the kind you hold in for days and days, waiting for one safe little corner where you can finally let them fall. For the first time since Daniel left, Emily had a roof over her head. And without knowing it yet, she had just started giving life back to a man who had given up on it. The first days on the ranch were made of careful silences. Emily and Robert moved through the house like two planets in separate orbits, aware of each other, but keeping their distance. She woke before sunrise, tidied the kitchen, made breakfast, and left everything ready on the porch table where he liked to eat while watching the sun come up. He thanked her with a grunt, at most a nod, and spent the rest of the morning in silence. But Emily, who'd learned from her mother how to read people by what they didn't say, noticed the small things, the plate always wiped clean, the cup always drained, and every now and then a glance he'd throw her way when he thought she wasn't looking. The house told that man's story better than he ever would have. Down the hallway, old photographs in wooden frames, a serious little boy standing next to a woman with a soft smile, a young man in uniform, chest puffed out with pride, a decorated officer shaking hands with important men. But not a single photo of a wife, not a single photo of children. Robert's life hanging on those walls was a life of achievement and of loneliness, of medals and absences. Emily dusted the frame of the woman with the soft smile with special care, not knowing that was his mother, the same woman whose coffee she'd unknowingly recreated. There was one photo in particular that Emily always lingered on a little longer while cleaning. It was of the serious boy standing beside his mother. The kid couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, in short pants, hair parted to the side, not smiling. But the mother, her hand resting on his shoulder, smiled enough for both of them. Emily would look at that and feel an ache in her chest because she knew that kind of portrait well. It was the photograph of a family that had little but loved deeply. You could see it in the way the woman's hand rested on her son's shoulder. You could see it in the quiet pride in her eyes. And Emily would think, running the cloth gently over the glass, that somewhere along the way, that serious little boy had ended up alone, and his mother's smile had disappeared from the walls right along with her. The house was too big. That was the plain truth. There were rooms Robert hadn't opened in years, doors shut tight, where the air smelled like mothballs and stopped time. Emily got to know every corner little by little, at the unhurried pace of someone who cleans without rushing. And in every room she found the same story of a life that had once been full and had slowly emptied out. Sheets thrown over furniture, fine china locked in a cabinet nobody opened because there was no company left to serve, a dining room with a table set for 8 where a lone man ate by himself at one end when he ate at all. It was a house that had been built for a family and had grown old waiting for one. One of those mornings, while dusting the front room, Emily found an old piano covered by a yellowed sheet, pushed into a corner like a piece of furniture nobody uses anymore. She lifted the sheet carefully and ran her fingers over the ivory keys, some of them yellowed with age. She didn't know how to play, but there was something sad and beautiful about that forgotten instrument, like it too was waiting for someone who never came back. She didn't know it had been Robert's mother who played it on Sunday afternoons while the boy played in the yard, and that the day she passed, the piano went silent right along with the house. Emily covered the instrument back up with the same care she'd used to tuck in a blanket over someone sleeping and went back to her work. But that piano stayed on her mind the rest of the day, without her being able to say exactly why. At night, alone in her small room out back, Emily talked to her son, resting a hand on her belly and whispering into the dark. She told him her plans, promised she'd find a way that he wouldn't go without. "We found us a little corner, baby," she'd say. "Ain't much, but it's a start." And the baby would answer with a kick, a little roll. And that, for Emily, was the closest thing to love she had in the whole world. She cooked for Robert all day. With the same care, she was preparing herself to become a mother, learning on pure courage how to take care of someone without really knowing how. There were nights fear came to visit her, the way it visits every mother sleeping alone, lying in that narrow bed, listening to the crickets outside and the wind in the trees. Emily would catch herself wondering what would happen to her a month from now, 2 months from now when the baby came. What if the Colonel changed his mind? What if she couldn't manage? What if that good little corner turned out to be just one more good thing life was going to take away from her, the way it had taken everything else? But then the baby would move, and she'd breathe deep and remember her mother saying, "You cross the bridge when you get to it." Not before. So she'd close her eyes and sleep the tired sleep of someone who'd worked all day. And the next morning, she'd wake before sunrise to make the coffee right again. Robert, for his part, started changing his routine without admitting he was changing it. Before, he used to wake late in no hurry because there was nothing worth getting up early for. Now he found himself awake before the coffee was even ready, waiting for the smell to rise. Before, he'd eaten out of obligation, chewing without tasting. Now he caught himself looking forward to the next meal, curious what she'd managed to make out of the few ingredients in the pantry. She turned the simple into something special. A pot of beans that tasted like a celebration, a Sunday chicken dinner that filled the whole house with its smell, a pan of cornbread he ate the whole thing of without noticing. It was like every plate brought a piece of the house back to life. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that the first wall between them really started to come down. Robert had dozed off in his chair on the porch, worn out by the afternoon heat. When he woke, it was nearly dark, and he was hungry and irritable, certain he'd have to fend for himself the way he did before Emily came. But when he rolled into the kitchen, he found a plate covered by another plate to keep the food warm, and a note written in careful, uneven handwriting from someone who hadn't had much schooling but had tried hard all the same. "Your supper's right here, Mr. Robert. I kept it warm for you. If you need anything, I'm in my room. Enjoy." Beside it, a single flower from the garden, one black-eyed Susan standing in a glass of water. Robert stared at that note for a long stretch. A flower in a glass of water. a plate kept warm by someone who cared whether he ate or not. It had been 22 years since his mother died, and nobody had left him a warm supper waiting. Nobody cared whether he ate dinner or went to bed hungry. He'd been living in a world where his own existence didn't matter to anyone, and he'd gotten used to it the way a person gets used to a chronic ache. But that single flower in a glass of water broke something loose inside him, something hard, old, crusted over. He raised a hand to his face and, surprised, found it wet. That night, Robert ate alone in the kitchen, savoring every bite in a way he hadn't in decades. And when he finished, instead of leaving the plate in the sink like always, he washed it himself, dried it, and put it away. Then he sat there a moment in the middle of his mother's kitchen, full of life again now, and whispered into the silence a word nobody heard, not even him. Not really sure he'd said it. Thank you. He wasn't sure who he was thanking. The girl, his mother, God, life itself. He only knew that for the first time in a long while he had something to be thankful for. It was Emily who found the hidden garden. Out behind the chicken coop, there was a patch of ground fenced in by a low stone wall choked with weeds, where a few stubborn rose bushes still fought to survive, along with a jasmine vine that insisted on blooming even in all that neglect. She stood at the edge of that dead garden and felt there was history buried there, love buried under all that neglect, and without asking permission, moved by some instinct that came from somewhere deep inside, Emily started pulling weeds with her bare hands, slow and careful not to strain her belly, uncovering little by little the flower beds someone had once laid out with love. It took days. Every afternoon, after tidying the kitchen, Emily went out to that hidden garden and worked until the sun started going down. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, watered the surviving rose bushes, and transplanted seedlings she found scattered around the property. Her hands, once only a cook's hands, grew calloused and stained with dirt, but there was a new kind of joy in her, the joy of bringing something dying back to life. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because, in tending that garden, she was tending to herself too, to the hope that kept insisting on blooming inside her despite everything she'd lived through. Robert didn't know about the garden. Not until the morning he rolled his chair along the side of the house, down a path he rarely took, and saw off in the distance something that stopped his heart. There was colour where there'd only been weeds before, red roses blooming, white daisies swaying in the breeze, jasmine perfuming the morning air, and in the middle of it all, kneeling in the dirt with a little trowel in her hand, her belly huge, her face sweaty and smiling, was Emily. Robert froze. That was his mother's garden, the garden she'd planted with her own 2 hands, that she used to water while she sang, and that he, after she died, had let the weeds swallow because he couldn't stand to look at it and remember. "What are you doing out there?" His voice came out harder than he meant it to, hardened by feeling he couldn't hide, and Emily jumped, startled, standing quickly and wiping her hands on her dress, her face flooded with fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Robert," she stammered. "I didn't ask permission, I know. I saw it all grown over and I couldn't stand to leave it be. I figured nobody cared about it. I'm sorry. I'll stop right now if you don't want me back here." "No." The word came out fast, almost desperate. Robert was surprised by his own urgency. He took a breath and tried to steady his voice. "Don't stop." He looked at the rose bushes, and his eyes shone in a way Emily had never seen. "This garden was my mother's. She planted every one of these bushes herself. After she passed, I didn't have the heart to tend it, or even to look at it. I let it die because it hurt less to see it dead than to see it alive without her." Emily didn't say anything. She walked over slowly and sat down on a stone bench nearby, waiting, giving him the space she sensed the moment called for. And Robert, who hadn't spoken about this to a living soul in 22 years, started to talk. He told her about his mother, the strong woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, who worked that land her whole life, who played piano on Sunday afternoons and tended that garden like every flower was one of her own children. He told her how he'd lost her too young, and how afterward he'd thrown himself into the army just so he wouldn't have to feel the missing her. He built a career, earned medals, commanded men, but he never built a family. She used to call this her corner, Robert said, nodding toward a rosebush of deep red blooms, the healthiest of them all. That one there, she planted the day I was born. Said as long as it kept blooming, it meant I was doing all right, wherever I was. He stopped and his voice thickened. You know, even out at some army post on the far side of the world, I used to think about that rose bush. Silly, I know. Grown man thinking about a rose bush. But it was my way of remembering that somebody once loved me in this world. Emily looked at that stubborn red flower that had survived 22 years of neglect and felt a lump rise in her throat. She told him then about her own mother, told him she'd also grown up without a father, raised by a woman who took in laundry and cooked for other people's parties, and that it was from that mother she'd inherited her hands and her love of cooking. She told him her mother died when Emily was 21, and the world had gone big and empty all at once, the way it does only for someone who's lost the one person they had. I think that's why I couldn't let this garden die, she said quietly, working the dirt between her fingers. When I saw these flowers fighting to live in the middle of all those weeds, it was like looking at myself. Like somebody needed to take care of them the way nobody's taken care of me in a long time. She laughed, a little embarrassed, wiping a tear with the back of her dirt-streaked hand. Sorry, I'm talking too much. No, Robert said, and this time his voice came out soft with none of its usual roughness. You're not talking too much at all. The two of them sat there a while in silence, two orphans of mothers who cooked and planted and loved the same way, sitting in a garden one of them had planted and the other had brought back from the dead. And in that silence there was more company than Robert had felt in 22 years, of a house full of photographs and empty of people. Why'd you never marry? Emily asked softly when he paused. Robert gave a sad smile, the kind that hurts worse than crying. Because I stopped believing, he said. I've seen a lot in my life, young lady. Seen people marry for money, seen people cheat, seen people stay together just so they wouldn't be alone. I figured real love, the kind that makes a person care for another without wanting anything back, the kind my mother had, I figured that kind didn't exist anymore, figured it was just a fairy tale. So I decided it was better to live alone than to live a lie. He looked at her, then out at the blooming garden. Been thinking that way for 22 years now. 22 years. What he didn't finish saying, but what hung there in the air between them, was the question now troubling that hardened man. What if he'd been wrong? What if, after 22 years convinced that true love was just something people made up, a pregnant woman cast off by the world had shown up at his gate to prove otherwise, not with pretty words, but with a cup of coffee made just right, a plate kept warm and a garden brought back from the dead. Robert looked at Emily straightening a rosebush and felt afraid. Not the kind of fear he knew well from the army. This was an older, more frightening fear, the fear of hoping again. And maybe it was that fear that kept him up so long that night, unable to sleep. Robert couldn't have said what it was, a tightness in his chest, a restlessness with no name, like his body sensed, before his mind did, that something big was coming. Outside, the wind was starting to shift. Above the Tennessee hills, still far off but moving fast, heavy clouds were gathering over the ridgeline. The longest night of both their lives was only just beginning. The storm hit on a night at the end of October, the kind where the sky over the hill country goes dark all at once and breaks open with a fury that seems bent on washing the whole world clean. Wind howled between the roof shingles, rain hammered the windows like fistfuls of gravel, and lightning tore through the darkness, lighting up the garden Emily had brought back to life. Robert was in the front room, unable to sleep with all that noise, when he heard over the roar of the storm a different sound, a moan of pain coming from the back bedroom. He wheeled himself down the hall as fast as his tired arms could push, his heart pounding, and found Emily doubled over on the bed, clutching her belly, her face twisted in pain, her nightgown soaked through with sweat. "Mr. Robert," she managed to say between contractions, it's hurting bad. I think the baby. I think it's coming and it's too early, it's still too early, it can't be now." And then she did the only thing a woman alone and terrified could do. She started to cry. A cry of pure fear. Fear of losing the one good thing she had left in the world. Robert felt the panic rise in him, But underneath the panic, the old military instinct took over, that part of him trained to act when everyone else freezes. "Listen to me, Emily," he said firmly, gripping her hand hard. "Look at me. You are not alone. You hear me? You are not alone anymore. We're going to get through this together." He grabbed the telephone, but the line was dead, knocked out by the storm. The truck was in the barn, but neither of them could drive it in that rain in that state. Town was 42 minutes away. Robert realized, his chest tightening, that they were entirely on their own. That's when he remembered Peggy Sullivan, the retired midwife who lived on the neighboring farm, just under 2 miles down the road, a woman who'd delivered half the babies in that county before the hospital ever came within reach. But how could he warn her in the middle of a storm with no phone line? Robert looked at the door, at the pouring rain outside, at his own legs that no longer obeyed him, and made a decision that months earlier he would have called impossible. "I'm going for Peggy," he said. Emily looked at him, stunned, caught between one wave of pain and the next. "What do you mean? You can't? It's storming out there. You can't?" But Robert was already pulling on his rain slicker, already pushing his chair toward the door. What happened that night, old Frank Callahan would tell for years and years afterward, always with his eyes welling up. Robert threw open the door and the storm poured in all at once, slapping rain across his face like an open hand. For one instant he hesitated there on the threshold, staring at that wall of water and darkness. Any man would have hesitated. But then, from inside, he heard Emily's moan cut through the night, and the hesitation died right there. He pushed the wheels hard and rolled down the ramp he himself had ordered, built years before, which now for the first time was actually good for something that mattered. The gravel road had turned into a river of mud. The wheels sank, spun, locked up. Robert pushed with both arms, with his whole chest, with everything in him, and with every foot gained, the mud seemed to want to swallow him right back. The rain was so heavy he could barely see in front of him. The wind howled in his ears, shoved the chair sideways, tried to throw him off the path. His arms, the ones that had carried a rifle, that had led men, that had done push-ups until he collapsed back at the base, now shook with an exhaustion he hadn't felt in 22 years. But they kept going. Stroke after stroke, they kept going. On the first fall, the wheel dropped into a ditch hidden under the water, and the chair tipped sideways. Robert went down face first into the mud. He lay there a second, 2 seconds, tasting dirt in his mouth, water running down the back of his neck, and a voice inside him, the old voice, the voice of fear, the voice of 22 years of giving up, whispered that he could stop right there, that nobody would blame him, that this was madness, a man in a wheelchair out in a storm like this, that he wasn't going to make it, that it'd be smarter to turn back. But that's when Robert thought of the little girl inside Emily, that life not even born yet already in danger, and he thought of his mother, and something she used to say, that you find out who you really are, not on the easy days, but in the hour when everything's stacked against you. So he dug his elbows into the mud, groaned like an animal, and hauled himself back into the chair. He fell again farther on, when a root hidden across the path threw a wheel up and over. This fall was worse, and he felt something tear in his shoulder, a hot pain that shot up his arm. He lay face down on the road, gasping, the rain pounding his back. 52 years old. A man the world had already retired from everything, including, it seemed, from life itself. And there he was, in the middle of nowhere on the worst night of the year, dragging himself through the mud for a woman who 2 months earlier had been a total stranger knocking at his gate. Robert laughed. He laughed right there in the middle of the storm, a strange laugh, half sob, because he understood in that instant something he'd forgotten, that being alive means exactly this, having someone to fight for, having a reason strong enough to get back up out of the mud one more time. And he got up. A man who spent his days sitting on a porch, convinced he was no good for anything anymore, crossed through a hell of water and mud, driven by a strength he thought he'd lost for good, the strength of having someone to fight for again. When the lights of Peggy Sullivan's house finally flickered into view through the sheet of rain, Robert could no longer feel his arms, couldn't feel the cold, couldn't feel anything but the stubborn will to get there. He reached the porch, nearly falling out of the chair, and pounded on the door with his closed fist, shouting for help with the last bit of strength he had, his voice hoarse and swallowed up by the storm. The door opened, and the light from inside fell over that man, soaked to the bone, caked in mud from head to toe, shaking, a gash across his forehead, his eyes wild. Peggy jumped, hand flying to her chest. "Colonel, Lord have mercy, what in the world—" But Robert didn't let her finish. "The girl at my place," he gasped. "She's having the baby early, she's all alone, I need you to come now, please." And that word, please, spoken by a man who'd spent his whole life giving orders and never once asking anybody for anything, was what made Peggy grab her bag before she even grabbed her coat. Peggy came, of course she came, riding on the back of her grandson's motorcycle, straight through the mud, and they made it in time. Emily had her baby in the small hours of the morning, just as the storm was finally starting to wear itself out, on a plain bed in the back bedroom, with Peggy's steady hands guiding her and Robert's voice on the other side of the door, telling her it was going to be all right, that he was right there, that she wasn't alone. And when the thin, strong cry of the baby cut through the quiet that followed the storm, Robert, sitting in his soaked chair outside the door, shaking with cold and with feeling, cried like he hadn't cried since the day he buried his mother. But this time they were tears of something else. They were tears of life. She was a tiny little thing, born ahead of her time, and in those first days she needed every bit of care, holding, warmth, warm milk given hour after hour, that Peggy taught Emily how to give with a mother's patience. But that baby was stubborn about living. Every day she gained a little more strength, a little more color. And when she hit her first week, she was already nursing with an appetite that made Peggy laugh and say, a baby like that, one had come into the world to stay. She came in with a will to live that didn't match her size at all. When Peggy finally laid that little bundle in Robert's arms, because Emily, exhausted, asked that he hold her first, and nobody quite understood why, but nobody argued either. The Colonel looked down at that small, wrinkled, red little face and felt the whole world rearrange itself inside his chest. 52 years convinced life had nothing left for him, and there it was, weighing less than 6 pounds. Everything he'd sworn didn't exist. "Welcome," he whispered to the baby, his voice breaking. "Welcome, little one." Word of the birth traveled through the neighboring farms faster than the floodwater from the night before, and something happened that nobody planned, but that was just the way of folks out in that part of the country. They started showing up. Peggy, of course, stayed the first few days to help, but then Frank Callahan's wife, Martha, came by with a pot of chicken and dumplings to build the new mother's strength back up. The neighbor from the farm up the ridge came with a stack of cloth diapers that had belonged to her own grandkids. The man who ran the general store in town showed up with a case of formula and a smile, saying it was on the house for the Colonel's baby. Robert's farm, which for 22 years had barely seen a visitor, was suddenly full of people coming and going, full of voices, of laughter, of life. Robert watched it all, a little stunned, like a man waking from a very long sleep and squinting at the light. He who'd gotten so used to the silence now had a house full of company. He who'd believed nobody cared whether he lived or died was discovering that the whole community had been right there all along, just waiting for him to open the door. It was Emily who'd opened that door. Not just the door of the house, but the door of his heart, which he'd kept locked with 7 padlocks. And now, watching Martha rock the baby to sleep while Emily rested, watching the neighbor arrange garden flowers in a jar on the table, Robert understood something his mother had spent her whole life trying to teach him, that people weren't made to live alone. That happiness is only ever real when it's shared. On one of those afternoons, Frank, the old ranch hand who'd worked that land for 32 years and had never in his life heard more than a clipped order out of his boss, sat down next to Robert on the porch, and the two of them watched the baby sleep in Martha's arms. They sat quiet a while, in that way countrymen have of saying plenty without saying much of anything. "You know, Colonel," Frank finally said, turning his hat over in his hands, "been 32 years I've worked this place. Saw this house happy back when your mother, Miss Eleanor, God rest her, was still with us. Then I watched it go quiet, year after year." He swallowed hard. "I ain't my business, and forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but it's been a long, long time since I seen you looking like this. Like a man that's glad to wake up in the morning. Makes me happy, Colonel. Makes me real happy." Robert, who a year ago would have brushed off that kind of talk, just reached out and squeezed his old friend's shoulder, unable to say anything back, because sometimes gratitude closes a man's throat. And it wasn't only Frank. The whole community seemed to have adopted that newborn family. The women took turns those first weeks helping Emily, teaching her the tricks only get passed mother to mother, how to burp a baby, how to tell hunger crying from colic crying, how to brew a little chamomile to settle a fussy stomach. The men showed up with a fence repair here, a fixed hinge there, a dozen eggs, a mess of greens from somebody's garden. The preacher from the little country church came by to bless the baby. Even the old druggist in town, whom nobody had even called, turned up one day with a bottle of vitamin drops to help build up the little one on the house, courtesy of the pharmacy. It was as if that child, born on the worst storm night in years, had been born the daughter of the whole community. Robert, in the middle of all that, was coming to understand that the loneliness he'd lived in for 22 years had never once been required of him. It had been a choice. And that at any point in those 22 years, all he'd needed to do was open the door to find out the world outside was full of good people just waiting to come in. On one of those quieter afternoons, with the house settled down again, Emily called Robert over to the makeshift crib where the baby lay sleeping. She'd been turning over a decision for days, and now she finally had the nerve to share it. "Mr. Robert," she began, her voice trembling, "I've decided on her name." He waited, curious. Emily took a breath. "Grace Roberta. Roberta after you, sir, because you're the one who saved us both that night, because you're the one who opened the door when the whole world had shut every other one on us. If it wasn't for you, I don't know where we'd be right now." Robert opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He reached a trembling hand over and gently touched the fine hair on the sleeping baby's head. 52 years convinced he'd die alone, leaving behind nothing and no one in this world. And now there was a child who would carry his name, a little girl who would grow up calling that farm home. He wasn't her father. He knew that. But this was something that maybe didn't have an exact name. He was the man who chose to stay, and that, he was starting to understand, mattered more than any tie of blood. "Grace Roberta," he repeated softly, savoring every syllable. "That's a beautiful name. Sounds like a name for somebody strong." Time moved on across that ranch the way slow river water moves, unhurried, but changing everything it touched. The little girl born on the night of the storm took her first steps, said her first words, blew out the candle on her first birthday cake in the garden. 1 year turned into 2, 2 turned into 3, and then 4, and then 6. And the white farmhouse with the blue shutters, which had once been the silent tomb of a lonely man, became the liveliest house on that whole stretch of road. Robert's mother's garden bloomed year-round now, tended by Emily's hands, and later, by the clumsy little hands of a girl who loved picking daisies to bring her pawpaw, because that's what Grace had taken to calling Robert since the day she strung her first words together. Nobody taught her that. It just came out the way truths come out of a child's mouth, needing no explanation at all. Robert, whom the doctors had long ago given up on, found in the years that followed a will to live he didn't even know he still had. He started going back to physical therapy, not because he believed he'd ever walk again, but because he wanted the strength to lift that little girl up, to push the tire swing he had hung from the old oak tree, to last as long as he possibly could beside the family life had stitched together for him right when he'd stopped expecting anything at all. The moment Grace first called him Pawpaw, nobody was ready for it, and that's exactly why it hit everyone so hard. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing special about it. The little girl, who could barely walk yet, crossed the front room on her wobbly legs, stumbling from one piece of furniture to the next, and ended up right in front of Robert's wheelchair. She raised her arms up to him, asking to be held, and said it as natural as anything in the world. "Pawpaw." Robert froze. He looked over at Emily, who'd stopped dead in the kitchen doorway, dish towel motionless in her hand. He looked back at the little girl. "What did you say, sweet pea?" he asked, his voice cracking. And Grace, impatient, stomped her little foot and said it again, louder. "Pawpaw, up!" Robert scooped the girl into arms that had crawled through a storm once, held her tight against his chest, and cried. cried without shame, without hiding it, a big man's cry, while the little girl, understanding none of it, played with the buttons on his shirt. Nobody had taught her to call him that. It just came out the way truths come out of a child's mouth, needing no explanation at all. And on a certain Sunday, something happened that made Emily drop what she was doing and run into the front room with her heart in her throat. The sound of the piano. Robert's mother's piano, silent for 22 years, was playing again. It was him, clumsily picking out by ear an old tune his mother used to sing. He played badly, hit wrong notes, started over. But he played. And beside him on the bench sat Grace, eyes wide with wonder, clapping her hands at every crooked chord. Emily stood in the doorway and watched, hand over her mouth, not sure whether to laugh or cry, because she understood in that moment that the house had gone back to being what it once was. A home, playing badly, playing beautifully. The relationship between Emily and Robert grew the quiet, deep way things do when they're meant to last. It wasn't some soap opera romance, all grand declarations and swelling music. It was something rarer and truer. Two lonely people who day by day, cup of coffee by cup of coffee, discovered they had room in each other's lives. He started looking forward to her every morning out on the porch, not the empty horizon anymore, but her smile bringing out the breakfast tray. She started telling him the small things of her day, the way you only do with someone who's become home to you. And on a Sunday afternoon under the old magnolia tree, with Grace playing nearby, Robert took Emily's hand and said it simple, no flowery words, just his own plain way. Stay, not as my cook, stay as my family, both of you, for good. And Emily, who'd learned to be suspicious of every promise ever made to her, believed that one, because it hadn't come from pretty words. It had come from a man who'd crossed through a storm for her. They married in a simple ceremony, right there in the blooming garden, with Peggy Sullivan crying in the front row, Frank in a borrowed suit, and the whole community that had once opened its arms to that family now gathered to celebrate it. Grace, 6 years old by then, carried the rings on a little pillow, proud as could be. And when the justice of the peace asked Robert if he took Emily to be his wife, the colonel, who'd spent half his life convinced true love was nothing but a fairy tale, looked at the woman who'd knocked at his gate one ordinary morning asking for work, and answered in the steadiest voice he'd ever used in his life, "I do. Today, tomorrow, and every day the Lord gives me." And there wasn't a single soul in that garden who didn't cry. One morning, a good while later, Robert was back out on the porch, taking his morning sun the same way he had on the very first day of this story. But nothing was the same anymore. Beside him, Emily sat mending a little dress for their daughter. Out in the garden, Grace chased after a butterfly, curls bouncing, her laughter filling up the morning air. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out from the kitchen, that same coffee made just right, that had once saved two hearts from dying of loneliness. Robert, taking it all in, thought back to the morning a tired, pregnant young woman had stopped at his gate asking for work. He'd almost said no, had almost let the fear talk louder than anything else, and if he had, he would have lost the one thing that gave his entire life meaning. He reached over and laid his hand on top of Emily's. She looked up from the little dress, gave him that smile he'd learned to expect every single morning, and didn't say a word. She didn't need to. They'd both learned by then that the deepest kind of love lives exactly there, in the comfortable silence of two people who are no longer alone. The iron gate at the front of the ranch stayed open, just like it had since that very first day. Robert made sure of it because you never know, he'd say, when life is going to send somebody down that road who needs a home just as much as a family needs somebody to love. And that house, once the loneliest place in the world, had finally learned to keep its door open. If this story touched your heart in any way, drop a single word in the comments. Family. I want to see how many people this story reached today. And tell me, which moment got you the most? Was it when Robert took that first sip of coffee and recognized his mother's taste? Was it when he crossed that storm in his wheelchair to save Emily and the baby? Or was it when little Grace called him Paw for the very first time? And don't forget to let me know what state you're watching from. I've gotten comments from all across the country, and every single one reminds me why I keep telling these stories. If you believe it's never too late to start over, and that family is a choice made by the heart, Give this video a like. If you know somebody who needs to hear that life still has beautiful surprises waiting, share this story with them. And if you want more stories that restore your faith in people, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of your heart and keep your gate open.